let's start with the title.
Oh
So your
my.
book, it's called Teaching Fools,
Yeah.
Masters and Mentors. Why? Why did you choose that? What does it mean to you?
Well, first of all, it wasn't the first title. The first title was something unwieldy like Howard Bauer's the buried life of a master carpenter on the south shore of Lake Superior. Blah blah blah. No, I knew that wouldn't work. So I came to Teaching Fools because I guess I reached the understanding that there were two teachers involved in this project. And my experience with Howard was that although he didn't suffer fools kindly, um, and he never fancied himself as a teacher, he um, frequently embraced the opportunity to help other people with their projects, and in the process to instruct them. Uh, but when I'm pressed to explain the title, I'm still not completely sure um, that that I know all the possibilities in it. On the one hand, teaching fools um, suggest the very worst connotation when one thinks of teachers. Let's say that I'm a teacher of the old school, and I look at my students and I say, "You're a bunch of fools," and I deign to teach you. I think we've all had a teacher like that at some point in our lives, where the guy made it seem like he was doing us a favor by spending his time on people who were barely educable. Um, the second possibility that I'm aware of is, I guess, what I'd call the Erasmian or Socratic possibility. Erasmus of Rotterdam um, is one of my most important intellectual mentors. He was a humanist scholar at the beginning of the 16th century, one of the earliest translators of the New Testament from Greek, and he wrote this little book to his friend Sir Thomas More, and he called it the Encomium Moriae, which means, loosely speaking, my friend Thomas More is a fool. And the book's a satire, and in it there is a character on a stage, um, dressed as a fool in cap and bells, confronting an audience clearly of adulating people who are bowing and scraping at her. It's a woman. You can make of that what you want, at her presence. And Volley goes on from that point to say that we're all fools. All of us are fools. Maybe 5% of us is rational, and the rest of us is a bundle full of enthusiasms, prejudices, um, emotions out of control. You might even say madnesses. Um, think of the most recent game that that the Vikings have played, and uh, look at the camera as it scans across the audience, and you will see people with painted faces, um, horns mounted on their heads, um, uh, their eyes made to look orange, as if they were mad Vikings. These people are clearly wrapped in this enthusiasm of um, adulating the Vikings. I'm that way with golf. I love golf. I'm a golfing fool. I'm no good at it, but it doesn't matter how bad I play, I can't wait to get out there again and do it. All of us have um, our own little enthusiasms, our own little hobby horses that we ride. There's no reason or rhyme to them, but in many respects, they're what make us human. And so Folly gets to the point in the book um, where she runs down a number of um, possible fools who have operated in the world. Socrates is one of them, having taken a fool for his client. And the most important fool of all, says Folly, is Christ. Because Christ celebrates and enthuses and attempts to convert us into understanding that what we cannot see, what is invisible, is reality. It's what's most true. There's nothing more foolish than that. And so that's the second one. Howard and I were both um, teaching fools in that respect, because Howard was absolutely in love with carpentry. He told me many times that if he could not get up in the morning and go to his shop and fire up his table saw, then he was effectively dead. He had to be doing it. And I guess to some degree I'm the same way about teaching. There's a lot about the things that surround teaching that I don't like, but the teaching aspect of it is crucial. There's a third one that struck me. When you look at the phrase teaching fools, and if you say it just right, if you say teaching fools, that is to say that teaching is kind of a ruse. It's kind of a trick. It's kind of an act of deceit, where you meet people where they are in terms of their prejudices, and in spite of those prejudices, you find a way to win them over to what you believe they need to know. Case in point, a friend of mine, Scott Hall, took me into his teaching classes a number of times to teach Shakespeare, 9th, 10th, 11th grade, Romeo and Juliet. And these kids had no interest in, Shakespeare. They had marginal interest in Romeo and Juliet, except perhaps for Leonardo DiCaprio. And it was our job to try to provide some background about Shakespeare, Shakespeare's time, who would come to the shows, what those shows would be like, and then parcel out several scenes to them and make them responsible for seeing themselves in those scenes. And to make a long story short, for the most part, we were really successful in doing that. They were pretty skeptical about us when we walked in. When we left, it seemed like they were having a good time. And Scott's and my intention was to make them believe that they were in there. Shakespeare's plays instead of being alien pieces of material to them, um, are things that they ought to be able to see themselves inscribed on them. They're all over these plays. But to get them there required an act of trickery. And in my way of looking at things, a lot of really good and exciting teaching involves trickery. And Howard told me himself that when he was hired on at a place in Fairfax, Virginia, to 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 clear bottlenecks, um, he approached that job um, with a trick. He fired everybody on who were responsible for framing. He just cleared the deck. And he went out on the streets and he collected a bunch of people who didn't know anything about carpentry or very little. And he collected them around him and he said, I'm going to teach you how to frame. And he looked at them and they all looked frightened and nervous and skeptical. He went ahead and threw a bunch of 2x4s on the deck and um, framed a window, framed a door, and he said, okay, guys, here we go. We're diving in. We're going to do it. It's really easy. Just follow my basic instruction, and we're going to frame this wall. And that's what he did. And it succeeded, maybe in some cases too well, because some people got so full of themselves that they thought they knew maybe more about carpentry than they actually did. But that approach, that trick approach that he used to nominally instruct a bunch of know-nothings to begin the task of framing is exactly what he did for me. Showed up one Saturday morning. Hi, Bill. Going to teach you how to frame. Throw the wood down, 2x6s. They're all over the place. Let's get up on this dance floor, Bill, and let's frame a wall. And that's exactly what we did, except that before the wall was finished, Howard jumped in his rattle-trap truck, backed up into the driveway, hit a tree, backed up again onto the street, and took off. Who was that masked man? I wanted to thank him. But he played a trick on me, and it was a good trick. He inspired me to believe that I could frame and that I could proceed in the rest of the framing tasks in the building from that point on. So I'm indebted to him for that. Good teaching.
Tell me the story of how the book came about. I guess that's ultimate. How did you decide that you wanted to tell Howard's story and also kind of your story as well?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part. It's a staged process. The first came after I'd been allowed to participate along with Chris, my son, in the cabin remodel project. Well, that was big for me. I mean, it was really big that originally I had put together this very small amateur crew that was going to do something with this cabin, and then Dan serendipitously came along, this professional carpenter who wanted to become a Lutheran minister and had all of these deficiencies before he could actually enroll in the theology program, and it just so happened he needed 2 Shakespeare classes, and so I got to know him, and he expressed interest in joining the crew, and he became the leader of the crew um, for the short time that he was engaged in it. But then Howard entered the scene, and as I describe him, kind of more Gandalf than Frodo. There was something about him that just zeroed in on Dan. Linda could see it, and what should have been an interview by Dan of Howard turned out to be an interview of Dan by Howard. Do you know your stuff? Can you explain to me the technical aspects of this job that you want me to step in and take over for you? But so quietly and so unobtrusively, letting Dan do all the talking. But it was pretty clear from the way Linda described it that no, the interview was by Howard of Dan. And so, when Howard joined the job, I got to see up close and personal what he was doing, how he was doing it, and both Chris and I became aware pretty early in the small incremental pieces of instruction that Howard gave to us about what we needed to do to be able to complement what he was doing on the job without getting in the way. That he'd done this before. I mean, he'd worked with people like me before, and he knew how to handle people like me in a gentle but firm way. I was going to be a part of the crew, and he was going to let me carry the heavy stuff, and he was going to just kind of, in some cases, ignore me and let me stumble along with my sheets of 4x8, 3/4 inch plywood, and let me reach the understanding that this is what it means to work on a construction project like this. So after the thing was done, it's not a big stretch to realize, given Howard's openness to us and the confidence that he showed in bringing the project to a close on the outside, that we'd become friends. And we did. We became casual friends, then close friends, and I'd go to his shop and watch what he was doing and drink his coffee, and Linda would become close friends with his wife Sally, who owned that shop that Linda was putting stuff in on a consignment basis. And a few years later, I asked Howard if it would be okay if I hung around the shop in a more intentional way. Could I see how you use the various machines in your shop, why you've organized them the way you have, how that facilitates a one-man operation like you've got in terms of efficiency. And then there was the opportunity for me to follow him around on site visits. And there was the opportunity for me to actually see how he did the construction of a piece of cabinetry. And when I went out on the job with him and he was doing estimates, I asked him if it was okay if I brought along a small tape recorder because I was never going to be able to remember this. There were too many numbers and measurements and everything else. I wanted to be accurate. I wanted to represent what it was that he was doing in a respectful way. And he said, yeah, it's okay. Things get a little bit edgy. When I went to his house one evening, I asked him if I could dig a little deeper into his beginnings, um, where he came from, how he learned his craft, what his family was like, um, how far his schooling took him, where did he travel after he left West Texas, how did he wind up in Hermster, for crying out loud, after having spent 20 years um, in and around the Beltway, Maryland, and Fairfax, Virginia, Washington, D.C. How did that happen? He was a little more reluctant to talk about some of that stuff. There was alcoholism involved in there. He still went to his weekly um, AA meetings. Not that I knew anything about any of that. And um, he agreed to talk to me about that stuff. And when I pressed harder on some of it, um, he opened the door a little bit wider and let me in. Um, it was at that point that I told Howard, I said, look, it's really generous of you to open up like you have for me. I'll tell you what I have in mind. Given our recent history, short as it may be, I've really come to respect what it is, not just what you've done for me, but what you do for a living, what you do solitarily in the shop. How you don't take any crap from people, but yet find enough willing clients to allow you to do their jobs the way you want to do them. I want to write about you. And the reason I want to write about you is because I'm going to make a present of this manuscript to you. That's my intention, Howard. And he said, oh. I said, I'm including it all. He said, okay. And so after that, there were some other jobs, but always the little tape recorder I had with me. And some of those site visits were just a blast. But when it was all done, and I hadn't completed the manuscript, but I showed him basically 85% of it. What do you think? He said, I like what you've done. I like the fact that if I were to work from the numbers and the measurements that you've represented in the book, I could pretty close to replicate what it was that I was building when you took those notes. And thank you very much for that respect. He said, I'm not crazy about what you've said about my life. I'm not crazy about the way that you've talked about my quitting school at 16 and getting married at 17 and leaving my first wife and living a life of the dissolute for a number of years. I'm not proud of the fact that I left Sally in the lurch for 10 years. But I understand why you wrote it, and thank you. So, yeah, that was my intention. I honest to God, I know it sounds weird, but I had no intention of sharing this book with anybody except Linda, the kids, Howard, and Sally. And I had the thing bound by Kinko's, and I gave him a copy, and that was it. He was happy to get it. Um, but yeah, maybe I'm kidding myself. Maybe I had ulterior motives here, because eventually I did seek an agent. Um, that agent, um, ironically, died a short time after I secured his assistance, and of course, he wasn't of much assistance, unfortunately, because of his illness. But I didn't get far um, looking for a wider audience, and the last serious um, attempts that I made to see if there might be more here than simply a gift to Howard was my mailing the manuscript to my intellectual mentor, Arthur Kinney, who published 25 books, and I mean, Renaissance books, but a whole bunch of other books on jazz and you name it. I said, "What do you think?" And he published one of the most important um, Renaissance journals um, in the world, and I'm honored to have found my way in with once. And he wrote back to me. He said, um, "I really like the stuff about you, Bill, but I think you ought to get rid of Howard." And I wrote him back and I said, "Yeah, but the whole reason for writing this book was Howard. There's a pre-Howard to this book. There's a Howard the Craftsman in this book. Um, there's Howard as the teacher in this book. I can't. I'm just a character in this book as well as the narrator. So I guess I figured at that point I couldn't go any place with it. I wasn't going to write him out of it. And then I showed it to Terry Davis a little while after that, and he liked it. He said, "No, this is good, but he said, you're wordy as hell. You need to cut the thing down," and I did. Um, and I mean, it looks a lot different than it did then, because I've gotten much more serious about editing than I was then. But that's basically it. I mean, Howard was the object and the
The
subject.
classes, I always remember you talking about audience,
Oh, yeah.
and it made me wonder, who is the audience for your book? I can imagine who, and I recommend your book to people, but I'm curious, like from the mouth of the author, who did you have in mind when you're writing this, and who's it for?
When I started drafting the manuscript, um, this was a pivotal issue for me. I harbored a distant hope that more than just myself would read this book, and that meant that I had to figure out who I might have intended to read it. I tried to make the case in the preface that I think this book is, and maybe it's special pleading, think this book is for just about anyone who is willing to step out, or who wants to step out of their daily routines and their comfort zones and to try something new, to take a risk. This the story of the book, in a way, is all about risks. Obviously, buying the cabin, neither Linda nor I had any idea where the money was going to come from to do that, and then neither one of us knew how we were going to come up with the money to make that cabin into what we had hoped it would be. But we took that risk. For me, although I'd done other projects with wood, I'd never been engaged in anything quite this ambitious before, but I always wanted to. I remember Linda and I were traveling to see friends in upstate New York way back when I think I was all but a dissertation many years ago in the 70s, and we drove by on a Sunday on a big major highway, a house in the process of being constructed, and I looked, and there were 3 people on the building doing various kinds of chores as we sped by at 70 miles an hour. I want a piece of that. I want to do that. At the time, there would have been no chance. I had no skills to be able to do that. The audience that I have in mind really doesn't have anything to do specifically with carpentry. I make it pretty clear at some points in the book. Look, if you're looking for a carpentry book, if you're looking for a how-to book, you're barking up the wrong tree. I'm not the guy to write that book. I can't do it. But if you're looking for somebody who is willing to take a risk, wants to take a risk, wants to try something different, and is willing to put him or herself out there, then read on, Macduff. I struggled too with the idea that maybe there was something sexist about my approach to this book. Men only need apply to read this book because people are using hammers to pound nails and saws to cut wood, and tapes to measure twice and cut once. But I've come to understand, probably through Linda and the many skills that she had developed, taught herself, making jewelry, one of those, that women can find themselves in this book as well. If you want to be constrictive and say, well, if you're talking about the building trades, what about them? Where are the women in it? They're all over the place in it. They're driving heavy equipment. They're operating jackhammers. They're doing all kinds of things. They're climbing all over buildings. And but the key here is not that. The key is taking a chance, stepping out of what's comfortable to you, and trying something different. And so I guess maybe that's why I decided to address that big audience in the colloquial and sometimes irreverent and might I say self-abasing um, tone that I use in the book. I'm making fun of myself throughout this book. Make no mistake about it. Um, a number of years ago, I think it might have been 7 or 8 years ago, the last time that I took a shot at a publisher uh, was a publisher in Duluth, and I was talking to Karen about this last night. Sent him the manuscript, and he wrote back a week later. Um, Something to the effect of, "You're making fun of the reader. I mean, you're laughing at the reader. You're not taking your subject seriously, and so no, we're not interested in this manuscript at all." I think he completely missed the boat. Uh, my approach here basically was to show the reader that I was learning as I was going and making mistakes all over the place, which I want to do in all kinds of endeavors. And it wasn't really my intention to to um, to use that approach to trick the audience into thinking that I was, trying to humanize my subject for my readers. It's just the way I am. Um, it's it's my voice. I'm talking directly to that audience, um, not above or below them, and I'm showing the dings and scratches on myself along the way, just the way it is. So
You mentioned Erasmus, which is one of the epigraphs that begins your chapters. And I'm just kind of curious in general about those. Like every chapter begins with a quote from something. And some of them are TV series. I had to ask you about it because I didn't know.
yeah.
Others are much more famous literary references that immediately I recognize. So I'm curious, like, what was your thought process? How did you pick those? Why this diversity of them? How do they work in the book?
I don't know how they work, but I'll tell you this. I came upon the idea from reading 16th, 17th, and 18th century books, mostly 18th century novels. If you read Tom Jones, you can see some of those epigraphs. Many of them, whether they're in Tom Jones or they're elsewhere, um, might be in Greek. They might be in Latin, uh, and the like. But yeah, I was kind of inspired to try out that approach. But then, and I'm not sure if this worked consistently throughout. My selection was based on the content of the chapters. I was looking for a hook. I was looking for something in some cases very literary. There's a couple of there are three important Shakespeare quotes in there, and one of them reflects directly on the relationship between Howard and his wife Sally. It's kind of a petulance in that relationship, a kind of War of the Roses kind of thing. And the Shakespeare quote that I chose, I kind of previewed that. I hope. Um, the final chapter, um, the Macbeth quote, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow reflects and, if you will, projects on the very end not only of the book, but of Howard's life and his life as a carpenter. I could see him struggling. I could see that he wanted to keep going. Um, the prostate cancer came back, and then it came back again, and he struggled to keep going, but he couldn't make it to the shop every day. But um, yeah, there was something about that quote uh, that suggested to me a kind of a desperation. I want to keep going, but pretty soon there's not going to be anything to live for. And then, of course, the graveyard scene quote. Uh, you know, who builds better than a carpenter? You know, or gallows maker. Yeah, and it just really seemed to fit. I'm a Dickens man, and I've got at least one Dickens quote in there that reflects on the character of Howard, um, and some of them are kind of insouciant, or um, you know, they're meant to be funny. Um, are you talking to me, or um, the famous quote from uh, what the heck is the name of the movie? I can't think of it.
You talking to me? Is that Taxi Driver?
That's Taxi Driver.
Okay.
But the one I'm thinking of is Clint.
Clint Eastwood, sure.
That's right.
Dirty Harry.
Yeah. And it fit because um, Howard had two sides to him. He was a gentle and quiet and generous man, but sometimes if he got angry, or if he found himself confronted by someone behaving like a jerk, or insisting that Howard um, build something um, his way rather than the way Howard knew it had to be built, he'd explode. He'd get really angry. And that particular quote kind of led into that a little bit. So, yeah, I don't know. There was something quirky about using that approach. In a way, I suppose you could say it was starchy filler, but it became something more than that as I went on. It became almost, for every chapter, thematic, you know, and kind of a preview of coming attractions.
I always enjoyed that when I mean, I studied with you, so like I know some of the older books, and I definitely came to appreciate those epigraphs. And I think for me, it's almost like, I don't know, as a reader, it was kind of a look behind the curtain, like, hey, here's upcoming attractions, kind of like how long the titles used to be, where they spelled out a summary of exactly what the chapter is going to be.
Right. Yeah.
But then it was also kind of a challenge to the reader to figure out, like, how does this fit? You know, why did I bother? And so, like, that's what I found myself doing with your book, is like, okay, he's referencing Shakespeare. Okay, I know enough about the play in this context to kind of see what maybe is coming. Oh, he did something that I expected, but a little bit different. Or like, I think it's Farscape is the space one. I was like, what the hell is this one? I don't even know what this is.
But there was trouble up there, and so it really did work. But I guess one of my favorite ones was the quote from the preface of Don Quixote, and you know, you and I both labored over that in class, that preface, and how incredibly important it is to the satirical approach of the book. Um, it's easy to blow up a dog, but it's really difficult to write a book. And there's a double message in there to the reader about the direction that this book is going to be taking. And the other part of using that Quixote quote is that Cervantes was a devotee of Erasmus as well, and so it's kind of a tip of the hat to that. Yeah.
Cool. Early on,
Mm.
and you say you resist calling the structure a cabin, and
Oh.
which makes me laugh because I'm originally from Michigan, and we would we call them cottages, and like there seems to be a divide between cabin and cottage and home or summer home, and I'm just kind of curious, like, one, why resist calling it a cabin? I mean, you say it in the book, but I'm just saying more about why you resist calling it a cabin, and then what do you make of how people refer to those in different ways? Like, is there, I don't know, if you're pushed to define a cabin versus a cottage versus a summer home versus a regular size house, what would you call those?
I'll tell you, I mean, there are people here in Minnesota um, who will invite you to their cabin, and when you get there, they're kind of palatial mansions. What? What is that? I mean, okay, they're living in a different world than I am. Yeah, it's an issue of semantics, but it's probably also a regional kind of issue. Um, you know, I affiliate um, the word cabin with Minnesota and Wisconsin. I just do. When I got here, um, and I'd been here for a little bit, we got invited to the cabins of 3 different families, and you know, uh, they were cabins. They were cabins. They were rustic, and the beams were exposed, such as they were. No insulation. This is the way it was, and uh, they were in some cases built on a slab, or um, maybe there was just a crawl space underneath them. Um, Mostly these cabins were on a lake of some sort. Um, there is this thing in Minnesota um, I found right away uh, that kind of expresses almost a religious um, quality, reverence for cabins. I'm going to my cabin this weekend. We're going to have the cabin cast tonight on the forecast to let you know if it's a good weekend for you to go to the cabin. Well, of course, we all know that cabins are very rarely about enjoyment. They're about work, man. They're about you go to your cabin, you got to work. It's like owning a boat. You're always working on your damn boat. And so, but long story short, the cabin is what I affiliate with Minnesota and Wisconsin. Where I come from, um, in northeast New England, um, I very very infrequently would the word cabin be used. Cottages, a cottage. I'm going to my cottage. Um, would be one way of putting it. Um, Beach house is another way of expressing it. And beach house could be, and I remember my parents taking me to one of these down on the Cape Cod, right on uh, uh, beautiful beach at Truro, um, about as wide as this table. It's a tiny little place, surrounded with maybe a wooden platform large enough to put a couple of Adirondack chairs on. That's it. Um, so it's really a question of I think locale, so many words that we use to describe various kinds of things in the Midwest as opposed to New England or wherever. Yeah, cottage. Um, yeah, like that. So
I think I always associate cabin with woods and cottage with lake. But yours is both. Yours is in the woods and it's on the lake. Well, one of the very biggest lakes. And
yeah,
it's kind of an interesting blend of
yeah,
the two of those.
yeah, yeah, yeah. What a lucky happenstance that was. I still remember the my persistence in buying the Sunday Trib and going through the classifieds and seeing if there was an ad there. It had the paper for the kind of cabin I was looking for on a lake. Who was I kidding? I mean, no way would anything that was worth any money at all would show up in the newspaper. It had already be sold by the time it got to the paper, and yet on one Sunday, there it was, this little ad, um, rustic, um, unspoiled, um, on the cliffs of Lake Superior, 4.5 acres, um, views of um, Eagle and Sand Islands, with just a hint of the corner of Oak Island. Come on, are you kidding? Somebody making this stuff up? And it's in the paper? The Sunday paper? Well, that was the place. And it was really cheap, and I don't understand why it was there or why it remained there while I was still dithering around trying to make an appointment to see it, but it worked out.
One of my very favorite parts of the book, and then there are lots of moments I love, but I love the moment that Howard walks away and he he comes to you and basically says like, I'm kind of done. It's not an ask. It's I'm leaving. I'm departing. And
Oh,
I was just thinking, and then he comes back. Like he goes away and in part like as the homeowner and the person building this, I can think of all the anxiety that goes into that. But what I'm focused on is like Howard recognizing that he's not in the best state to accomplish the task and that he needs to go away. And then he comes back with renewed focus and vigor and attack and just knocks it out. And well, at least that's my takeaway. And I was thinking like that is not something that we often have the gift of these days. Whether you're in school
yeah.
and you have 15 weeks and then you have deadlines to produce papers or read books or whatever, there's not a lot of time built in for revision or idea generation or whatever you want to call it. All those things, that make something better.
Right.
And I remember you talking about this book kind of beginning during a sabbatical when you are literally taking a break from your regular job.
That's right.
And I don't know, there's something about that ability to recognize that you're not at your peak and then seek out that break. And I don't know, like why do you in the book tell me, I guess, how you see Howard working during that break. And then in general, I'm just kind of wondering, like, if we recognize that it's something that's valuable, why don't we allow for it more often, do you think?
Well, sure. Yeah, it's it's so much more rare for for somebody in the trades to um, approach an employer or a client and to say, I'm kind of burnt out. I could really benefit from a month or whatever. Got some business that I have to take care of, and if you could allow me that time, I'd come back refreshed and focused, and I guarantee I'll come back. It takes a lot of trust on the part of the client or the employer, first of all, or it takes a lot of gullibility. I'm not sure where I sit on all of that. I know I was absolutely dumbfounded when he came up the driveway, not clearly ready to work. He wasn't dressed as he would be if he were ready to work. And the fellow that he normally worked with wasn't coming up the driveway in his work van either. And I was really caught at a loss. First of all, I'm absolutely lousy at confrontation. I'm terrible. People can put things over on me because I might go a little bit too far in avoiding that confrontation. If I'm in the confrontation, that's different. But I prefer to avoid it if I could. I really believe everybody ought to get the opportunity to refresh from their work. Unfortunately, for people who are their own bosses, that opportunity doesn't exist. If you have a regular employer throughout the year, you might be able to make that work, and I would be all for it. But if you're an independent and you've taken on a job, or you've signed a contract, or there's an agreement in principle, I mean, this is a fireable offense. I mean, I'm sorry. You want how much time off and why? I've got this job that has to be finished. The back of the house is wide open to the weather. Come on. What do you mean? Well, I never said any of that stuff. I simply listened to him, and he was very quiet in explaining what it was that was bothering him. He didn't tell me everything. I only found out later the rest of it. Yeah, he needed to see his wife. He hadn't seen her for close to a year. And although I make several jokes about why he might have wanted to see her after having not seen her for a year, I believed him. And I also believed him when he said, look, Jerry's going to carry on. We need to put an asterisk after that one. Jerry's going to carry on. I've employed 2 other people who they're not going to be making the same amount of money as I would if I were working it, but they're going to be there to be helpers. And of course, you're going to be there, and you're getting better all the time. When am I coming back? I'm not sure. I think it'll be about a month. Well, it's almost a month to the day. And I said, okay, well, I hope you'll come back because I love your work. Your work is great. And I've really enjoyed working with you. He said, I'll be back. I promise you. What I didn't know was that Howard harbored this suspicion that Jerry was undercutting him, that there was sabotage afoot. Um, I can't verify that. Um, when Howard called me from the cabin, um, 250 miles away, and told me that he had kicked Jerry off the property, and that they'd had a real blow up, and that it had to boil down to sabotage. I was shocked because I didn't get any of that vibe to begin with, but clearly there'd been some professional disagreements. There'd been some friction. Um, I could feel that from the very first meeting on the site, where Jerry showed up in his Ray-Bans and, his shorts and his boat shoes, and it was clear that he disdained the job. He didn't care that much for being there. Very different from Howard's approach. And then as the job went on, Jerry got embarrassed by how little he was prepared for some of the challenges that job presented. We had a hell of a job on the joists after we'd torn the roof off, trying to get all of the blocking in and all of the ends cut off so that we could actually build that second floor. And he kept getting it wrong. And I say this at the time as a neophyte, but I could tell he was having trouble because of the directions that he was giving me. Here, take the sawzall and cut these ends off. Well, no, cut them like that, cut them like that. So there were professional disagreements, and there was jealousy that was going on in there that complicated the whole reason for what Howard was asking the extra time for. Putting that all aside, though, I know when I walked in the house and I said, "Where's Howard?" I said, "Howard won't be back for a while." I can only imagine what my face looked like to Linda. What the hell just happened here? But I really believed him. I trusted him. Something was wrong. He had to fix it. He had to go 1,500 miles in order to fix that. And once it was fixed, he'd be back. And he was. And I'm so glad that I trusted him to do that. But it was most unusual. And under the circumstances, the sabbatical issue, so important to me in my professional life, was a very different kind of an animal in these circumstances. He got a sabbatical. He got a sabbatical from me. But it was totally different from any other sabbatical that I'd ever encountered. Yeah.
Well, I think because, I mean, part of me wonders if you weren't more beyond, aside from not liking confrontation, if you weren't maybe more accepting of the idea of a break because sabbaticals are built into your job.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of
Yeah.
a unique thing. I think most people would be like, what the hell? What do you mean? Like nobody can do that. You can't just take a month off. Now, sabbaticals aren't really designed that way either. They're supposed to refresh and research and, produce
Absolutely.
something.
A lot of work happens in
So your sabbatical would be very different than the sabbatical that Howard took. Not that he wasn't doing work, just different kinds of work.
No, and teachers like me, we get no end of crap from people about the fact that we get our summers off. Kind of a little sabbatical there. We get paid. while we have that summer off. Sometimes we're teaching. Sometimes we teach 2/3 of the summer, like I did that particular summer, and leaving, just maybe a month, 3 weeks to get ready to go back to school again. But um, yeah, people continue to rag on folks like us who get the summers off. We don't get the summer off. What are you talking about? That's maybe the United Auto Workers are bargaining for something very much like that right now. They want more time off.
Hearing you talk, I think about Jerry and Howard, and then thinking about the other people that are in the picture. There's Dan earlier, and they overlap slightly, but it's kind of more of a handoff. There's you, obviously, and then there are lots of other crew members that go unnamed, but are also present on the job as well. And it really struck me as it is such an interesting, I don't know, in classes, people abhor group work, right? Like group projects are the worst because I always end up carrying the burden or whoever, there's the different dynamics. And,
Right.
and I'm struck by the number of
That's the way
fields
work gets done, man.
that require group work
Absolutely.
that we, I think, don't think about. Whether you're talking about a film, you label the director and maybe you credit an actor, but there's the cast and crew is huge.
Sure.
Again, strikes right now.
Sure.
And then, even comic books, have a writer and an illustrator and a penciler and an inker
and they're all meeting at various points along the way to share what they've come up with at that point and see if they're all working on the same quote page unquote. So no, that's the way work gets done. And I've always pushed against. I know what you're saying about kids hating the group work. Always push back. I always push back and say, you're going to find yourself in a pod very much like the kind of pod I'm going to be putting you in here, and you're going to have to cooperate. You're going to have to collaborate. You're going to have to suppress your ego a little bit, or at least find a place to put it while you're working with these other people. And the group thing matters a lot to me. And of course, Howard made that point too. When he was talking to me about bottlenecks, and you have all of these trades working, it's kind of a ballet. You've got one group coming in here and doing the concrete work, and then you get somebody coming in and do the framing, and then you got steel workers coming in, you got the plumbers, on and on and on, and they all have to be timed. They have to be working according to a schedule, or it gets all screwed up. So I don't know. Well, I guess I do understand why students have a lot of trouble with group work, or even to the point of sharing credit for the work that they do. No, it's my work. No, because that's the way things work in high school a lot. It's my work. I did it. Don't look over my shoulder. It's. I think that's changing, but not quickly enough, unfortunately.
I think in the case of Howard and building Kevin, it just really struck me how, he is, despite the ability in the instance you give where he fires everybody, that's not a privilege he typically has. You are often at the whim and mercy of whoever is around. And so, right. Great. Howard's great at finishing, and he can certainly do the building and the framing and all those things also, but his love is the finishing work, the detail.
It is.
But to get to that point, you need to build the structure, you need the plumbing, you need the electrical, you need all of these other things that maybe he could do, but it's not necessarily his passion or that he's the most gifted at. And so, especially when you take something to the South Shore and you are removed from a lot of the big city availability of some of those services, then your choices are even fewer. So you have to put ego aside somehow to get along with people. And I would love to know more about the cast and crew who, essentially built the cabin. What was that like, Jerry aside? That sounds like they butted heads.
Well, um, it was pretty straightforward given the fact that the crew was small. I mean, it was Jerry, um, and once the amateurs took off to go back to school or whatever they were doing, it was Jerry and Howard and me, and Chris, and then Chris went back to school. So it was basically the three of us. Where things that got complicated um, were when um, we had to make room for interruptions by other people who were coming in. The plumber, Mr. Blakeman, came in, and he had to dig a couple of huge holes for the holding tanks, and he had to put the plastic pipe in that led back to the house, and then of course he had to rework that space that um, we had constructed as a bathroom space, to put in the one piece a shower and toilet and little sink and stuff like that. And we may have gotten ahead of ourselves a little bit, although Howard never said a word about it. We brought in a tile man to do um, the kitchen, and working around to the entryway, and then into the bathroom itself. We got that all set, and so various trades were coming in, and in order to facilitate one of the processes of the job, the and Dan was still there for this. Um, yeah, Dan was still there for this. The most important part of the job required um, the greatest number of people, and that was once that window wall of 18 feet um, at a 14-degree angle was built, and Howard had shot um, zillions of nails into that wall to stabilize it against racking. There was the process of having to have, and this happened periodically through the job, but for this particular part of the job, it was really important. The delivery of those 35-foot, 35-foot laminated beams, and Howard, was confronted with, first of all, how do we get those up into that window opening? The roof was all framed, um, and there's this fairly large opening for a window at the rear of the building, and there's that um, uh, beautiful bird's mouth above the window, quite a bit above the window, and in the front of the building, which I label as pointing towards the lake, another bird's mouth, 18 plus feet high, same in the back. How do we get those beams in place? And so Howard and Dan were primarily responsible for building the catwalk. That it wasn't enough to just have um, the scaffolding. We needed a catwalk that went from front to back, and so they constructed that. We were able to build a lot of it in place on top of scaffolding, and then um, the issue was, how are we going to get these glue lamps through this window space and not do a heck of a lot of damage? And that's where the whole notion of master carpenter comes into play. Um, it's not just knowing how to use the tools and to be able to measure and build things plumb, level, and square, and follow um, proper building principles. There's a notion of the creative imagination, being able to create your own tools or even medieval machines to be able to get the job done. And that's what Howard did. He built what he called a Trojan horse that once a pole truck was on site, which Howard arranged um, from uh, the sawmill just located up the street from where he lived, um, and uh, driven by a close friend of his and sometimes a worker on some of his jobs. To get that on site, the glue lamps are on site. Everything is delivered just right in sequence. And then each one of those beams is hoisted up through that window. We're up there, Chris and me and Dan, um, and Howard is down below managing um, one end of those glue lamps, and 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 Dan is instructing us how to move those glue lamps all the way to the front of the building. And then when the four of them are up there, we've got to use these huge bolts. We got to bore through them, and then we have to use these huge bolts to put them um, together. And that's going to be that's the basis of the structure of the building. That was the thing that gave Howard the greatest amount of trouble, and that required the greatest number of people to contribute in their way to um, making that happen. And yeah, it came off beautifully, um, but we couldn't have done it really without um, two really skilled carpenters, Dan and Howard, um, putting that catwalk together. I still have that catwalk out there. It's a bunch of flaps that I used to walk down to the gazebo that I built a number of years ago. Um, and everything worked beautifully to make that happen, and it solved the problem. And I think, in looking back on it, I think this might have been one of the reasons why Howard asked for the sabbatical. I don't think he knew at that point um, how he was going to solve that problem of racking and hanging the entire building on what seemed like a skyhook at that point. When he came back, he knew. He knew. Um, and he thought it all through. Um, but yeah, I mean, think of the number of craftsmen and tradesmen that Howard knew. Just as a sidebar, um, once those glue lamps were in place, and the the window wall was secured, we needed to get those windows in. You know how big those windows are. I had borrowed some scaffolding from the Bayfield Pirates, who'd screwed up the crawl space so badly I would not give them back their materials until I was able to use them as the foundation for putting up those windows. So Howard brought over about, I don't know, 6 or 8 guys, a whole bunch of people that he brought over. And yep, one at a time, 6, 4, 2. We got them all in there. And it was a precarious task because they had to, the reason we had to have 6 or 8 was because they were so heavy. They had to be handed up to us and we had to put them in place, and then we had to use our guns to nail those things in place. Yeah, that required a great deal of cooperation from people who were skilled at this sort of thing or not, just happened to be around. You know what I mean? So yeah.
I'm really struck by how, in so many ways, like Howard acts as a conductor, like for this big orchestra, big or small, right? It grows and shrinks as needed.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, and I don't know classical music well enough to make this analogy, so it may be unfair, but Howard knows each of the instruments and what they should look like afterwards. Like he knows that the plumbing is poorly done, or if the electrical is run in a way that is a problem. He's more than project manager. You've caught him at the end of his career, and like part of me wonders, like, would he have taken this on earlier in his career, and how would that process have looked like compared to the Howard that you got doing this and thoughtfully going like, man, I need some time to figure this out.
I truly believe him when he said, I'm taking on this job because it's interesting. I don't think I've ever encountered anything quite like it before. I believe him when he said that. And this from a guy, had been working for 50 years at his craft, pretty much seen it all, done it all. And there were wrinkles in this particular job that caused him to say, no, I'm not quite done with outside work. I want to do this. I want to do this. And part of it was the creative element, I think, in him. But I'm not sure that he would have done something like this early in his career. One of the things that struck me about his early career was he was busy pounding out tract houses as fast as he could punch them out. He learned his lesson trying to sell them on spec. That didn't work out for him. But during the building boom after the war, that's what he was doing. There weren't a lot of nuances to the houses that he was building. The real nuances that he got into had to do with the fine furniture that he built and the research that he had to do in order to build it. But I'm still struck by the fact that as busy as he was then, and as tired as he was of a dangerous work outside, he made an exception. He didn't know us, you know. He wanted to take it on because there was a challenge there for him, and there was a problem to solve. I don't think he would have done that early in his career. As I'll relate later on, I'm deeply in here too. First as a curious observer of his professional doings, then as a tentative translator of some of what I'd learned from him into some, at least for me, challenging attempts at carpentry around my cabin on the edge of the lake 8 miles west of his shop. And finally, as an enthusiastic informal student who applied some of Howard's semi-patient lessons to the construction of a large, freestanding 2-story building. It's about process and sequence. Hopefully, I've been true to the recreation of those in the retelling, as well as the stories, both his and mine, that have led him to lead me to this stage of woodworking adequacy. But it's also, I hope, about the character of the South Shore, the living and changing body of water that breathes silently but speaks deafeningly. There's nothing quite like it. The North Shore, the lights of which I can see twinkling through the proud front window wall that built when he was a mere kid of 65. It's picturesque indeed, but it's got nothing on what we have. And unlike the North Shore, our piece of paradise is still a comparatively undiscovered treasure. I want to convey at least some glimpses of it. And here comes one now. A year ago last April, I woke up to the most feathery snowfall. As I stepped outside to use nature's executive washroom, sending a red fox scurrying from atop the holding tank hill just a few yards away toward the big lake, I saw no more than an inch had covered my old F-150. While the Twin Cities were nearly snowless, a few hours later I had to wrestle the truck through another 8 inches of snow, and then another 2 miles of an unplowed gravel road to Route 13. By 4 p.m. after a day of writing, I looked out the upstairs gable window on a diminishing snowfall that had accumulated an additional 5 inches. A perfect opportunity to strap on the snowshoes that Karen and Christopher had given me for Christmas instead of the usual sweater and do a little tramping. Total silence, except for the gentle rolling of the lake. Magic. It was still snowing from a lowering sky when I emerged from the driveway and headed north up our little spur on Squaw Point. Perfect and pristine, this new and now heavily moistured layer of snow mantled the tall pines and spruce. As I turned back toward the cabin, my only companion was a solitary pair of pileated woodpeckers performing some earnest test drilling on the bark of a dead paper birch. Deciding once I'd reached the cabin's big back deck to shed the snowshoes to trudge knee-deep over the narrow wooden flats barely discernible beneath the snow, I reached the open gazebo perched on the brownstone cliff 25 feet above the water. But before I reached it, I saw what I'd never seen in 29 years and several ice storms up here. A stand of young aspens, birches, and woody brush bowed to the ground as if in silent prayer, weighed down and twisted by a thick layer of ice and snow. I'd need to tread very carefully so as not to step on and break the level trees that, by the spring, would return to the normal attitude. And when I'd successfully negotiated the path to the inside of the gazebo, I glanced to the east just in time to catch a mature bald eagle rising up from the lake's surface with talons gripping a lake trout and moving gracefully in full shoulder flap directly away from me toward the shelter of Myers Beach, one inlet away. Breathtaking. You can't make this stuff up. Howard had always preached to me never to be too busy to lift my head up from my work, to appreciate the joys and gifts of this special place. And besides, it's an integral part of enrolling in Howard University. So I've had 2 recent and unfortunate encounters with chainsaws. The first one occurred about 2 months before I actually began to build the garage. I located the best possible site for the carriage house, but it was a fairly rough patch, directly west of the main house and into the woods a bit. I liked this spot. It was surrounded by lots of birch, aspen, fir, and maple of various ages, whereas the area where I wanted to clear had mostly scrub and dead trees in the middle of it, with the exception of one towering dead paper birch. When we'd built the main cabin, we'd used this area to deposit most of the building scrap. There were 2 huge, roughly framed boxes overflowing with refuse from the old cabin. It took several days to pick it all up and dispose of, along with the endless network of brambles and blackberry runners. But when all was said and done, there was the tree. I bought a chainsaw just for this purpose, one appropriately labeled the Wild Thing. There wasn't much to it, really, beyond a sheath of Kelly green plastic covered with multicolored logos. After I'd given the manual a cursory scan, the information related to fueling and starting it up attracted most of my attention. I assembled the bar, mounted the chain, and oiled the machine, and fired it up. No problem so far. Overwhelmed with my success and the Wild Thing's throaty roar, I waded into the underbrush towards the huge birch and a number of small, standing, or already fallen dead ones. Prudence required that I take a hack at some of the smaller stuff, so I set to the remaining high stump of a tree that had been felled the year earlier. No problemo. Ditto for the assortment of dead ones spread on the forest floor. Linda stood behind the screen of the sliding door and watched nervously as I gained confidence from the successful cuts I'd been making. It took me 30 minutes of indiscriminate slicing through downed logs and into the ground before I reached the big dead one. As I held the idling saw, I harbored second thoughts. I knew the way I wanted to make the tree fall, away from the house and somewhat west through a little slough that opened toward the water. And then I looked back at the house, uncomfortably close, perhaps 75 feet away, a distance maybe 10 feet short of the height of the missile I might be launching at it in Monty Python fashion. As Linda opened the slider and stepped on the deck to get a closer look, I approached the tree and applied the bar against the side where I wanted to cut my first notch. No sooner had I revved up the saw and touched the change of the tree when the entire bar collapsed and fell in painfully slow motion to the base of the tree. The engine of the saw continued to idle, the saw barless, and its operator brainless, as Linda leapt off the deck and plunged towards me into the brush to determine that I hadn't eviscerated myself. But really stupid people, I've come to find out, rarely get hurt. It's the innocent and unsuspecting who are caught up in the collateral damage. In this case, the idiot walked away unscathed, but this was too beautiful. I'd neglected to perform the most basic maintenance function on a new saw. Retighten the two main bar bolts after the first 20 minutes of the saw's operation. The most just result would have had me sliced and diced in the truest Ed Popeil tradition. Instead, after unloading a full measure of scorn upon me, then it made me gather the shards of the saw together into a little basket and transport them to the saw repair service in Herbster, where I was forced to repeat the story of my wild thing mishap to the wild amusement of the laborers and locals in the shop. I'd created a new house of mirth, and the technician was able to tell in an instant that I'd ruined the chain by repeatedly grounding it on the forest floor. Thrilling public exposure of ignorance and humiliation. I'd fully earned it, and this all in the first 24 hours of having owned the wild thing. One would think that and the 2 hours it took me to cut the big dead birch down with a dull axe would have been enough to convince me that I should put the power tools away for good and hire a carpenter before putting myself at risk again. But there was more damage to be done, more petard to be hoisted. After I'd given my hands a chance to heal from the axe flailing 2 days previous, it was time to reclaim the wild thing. When Linda refused all my bribes to pick it up for me, there was nothing left to do but suck it up and make another personal appearance at the House of Mirth, dismissed by the technicians with a stern warning not to use the chain saw bar as a garden weasel. Along with a chorus of laughter, I sped back toward the cabin, knowing that there was one more large piece of tree surgery to perform. Linda had requested that I get rid of a large birch tree that had emerged from the middle of a topped fir only 30 feet from our back door and now hovered some 90 feet over the new roof of the cabin in some unknown state of decay. She'd made it clear that I could call a local tree surgeon we'd used before if I didn't feel capable of performing the task myself. But armed with a new chain, a fresh read of the owner's manual, and chastened by my experience with the big dead one, I was ready to have a go at it. And Howard? Well, Dan had already shared with me his concerns about whether Howard was up to the task of outdoor construction anymore. He was 65, for Christ's sake. Hell, I was 52 and I knew how tired I was. I remember enjoying a brief waking hallucination of Howard stroking out on top of one of the 12-foot 2x6 walls with a fully loaded pneumatic framing hammer in his hand and pitching headfirst into the deck below with his gun blazing. What a lawsuit that would have made. That's why Howard's appearance on the job site was so mind-blowing. It was getting to be a very hot one when Howard drove down the driveway that August mid-morning. Absolutely brilliant, bugless, and still. I got my first real look at him when he stepped up onto the 18 by 24-foot deck we hoped to see transformed into a great room. There was decidedly no grace in his step. He moved his blocky, thick frame with short and jerky steps, almost as if he were a bit hamstrung. I didn't know it then, but Howard was carrying himself this way in response to a balky, painful back condition. This was, I decided, a much-scarred veteran of the carpentry wars. But there was no mistaking the strength that his thick forearms and upper body still possessed when he reached out with equally thick and stubby fingers to shake my hand. The smile was gentle but guarded. His hard and crinkled and wide-set eyes firmly meeting mine, set up a broad nose that adorned a large sheep-like head. This guy wasn't going to win any local beauty contests. His neck was foam pole thick, and there wasn't much of it that could distinguish where his shoulders began. His thinning and receding dark wavy hair was swept directly back and cropped short. The skin on his face was heavily wrinkled and parchment thick from years of direct exposure to the sun and cigarette smoking, and that face, along with the light beard that mantled it, made the word grizzled sound like a euphemism. And he was dressed in the uniform that I've come to associate with Howard when he wasn't on the clock. He was as he was mostly, hatless. He wore a relatively nondescript plaid short-sleeved button shirt. It was probably well-aged, but it was clean and neat. The pants were clean, heavy, tan-cuffed khaki. Not the kind of thing one might associate with casual summer wear. This was vintage Howard. As I would come to find out, this was as good as it got for this no-frills man. The standard issue for job estimates as well as evenings out at restaurants. The shoes were of the heavy leather low-cut work variety, and they, like Howard, had lots of miles on them. No false airs here. Take 'em as you find 'em, or the hell with you. But Howard hadn't come alone. Another figure considerably taller, much younger, maybe in his early or mid-40s, fit, but for the beginnings of the softening muscles in the face, neck, and body that come with middle age. This guy carried himself with an attitude of studied ennui, a light touch of arrogance and aloofness that I'd felt at conferences from some professorial types who were full of the reputation they'd established. As it turned out, the small talk that followed confirmed my hunch that Jerry, that was his name, had recently been an academic in the art department at Iowa State. He'd been involved for some time in designing and constructing elaborate sets to display the work of important artists around the country, even London. He'd fashioned some wood sculptures of his own, had become bored with teaching, and had become intrigued with the prospect of establishing himself as an independent building contractor while cultivating his artistic bent by designing, building, and installing one-of-a-kind wooden circular stairways. With his wife still holding a secure position in Iowa State administration, Jerry had abandoned his own security, given up his tenured position, bought a piece of property on the cliffs above Herbster, and been splitting his time between local carpentry projects and the construction of his own small three-storied cabin overlooking even steeper cliffs above Superior. Noting that the exposed ceiling joist would soon become a second-floor loft, Jerry casually handed me a professionally made brochure that advertised a couple of Jerry's finished circular stair products. It was indeed beautiful craftsmanship, and I told him that we might be the mark for something just like it down the road. As the chat over the building project became more intense between Dan and Howard, and as Howard began to scrutinize the details of the architect's plans, Jerry's interest and attention discernibly waned. It became pretty obvious, even to someone as desperate for a bailout as I, that Jerry disdained my little project, except for the views of the lake it afforded. He was merely out for a Sunday drive. When he did hazard a comment, it was to gain confirmation for what he understood to be stuff out of Carpentry 101. The deceptively straight-ahead joisting and blocking of the old ceiling above the kitchen to create the loft, the 4-foot knee walls on which would be mounted a plain 6-12 pitch roof complicated by a dormer on the west side. Another slightly idiosyncratic little roof below that dormer. It would sit atop the new bump out for the bathroom and west side entry. He seemed mildly amused about the problems of stabilizing that main roof, whose weight would be borne solely by laminated beams to be situated, of all places, above a large window opening at the rear and over the two proud front walls at their point of jointure. Piece of cake? About as foppish as one could look in the middle of the woods, Jerry posed contrapposto, with his arms akimbo in expensive print shirts, sailing shorts, and spotless boat shoes, his dark-tinted Ray-Bans tilted jauntily toward the sun, his sun-bleached brown hair barely disturbed by the light breeze off the lake. Within a week, he'd be brought to his knees by the hidden challenges of joisting over the kitchen, and after that, he'd lose his arrogance and become likable. Meanwhile, Howard and Dan were bonding. The very best part of Dan showed through here. I think that the professional simpatico he felt with Howard was the key. Howard told me several times long after the fact that he felt those sympathetic vibes from Dan too. A little like falling in love. Maybe a lot. But even though their discussion involved the expectable under the circumstances, a no-nonsense, jargon-driven explanation of what he'd done, the housejacking, the careful interpretation of the architect's blueprints, along with commentary on the real engineering nightmares they posed. There was no mistaking that this was a job interview. Weirdly, though, the roles were switched here. Whereas I would have expected that Dan would have been grilling Howard about his fitness and competencies for this job, it was clearly the other way around. There was nothing overt or aggressive about the role that Howard was playing. Quite to the contrary, he was quiet, respectful, very careful in the questions that he directed to Dan about what he'd been doing and how he'd been doing it. Quite naturally, he wanted to know everything about the project, including the building's history right from the beginning. But the point of his questions had nothing to do with me or Linda. He was a perfect gentleman with us, and he never excluded us from the conversation. But his attention was riveted elsewhere, on Dan, on the plans, and on the structure. Howard needed to have two important issues confirmed. That Dan knew his stuff and could communicate it succinctly and precisely to Howard, and that Dan cared as much about the job and developing solutions to the problems it posed as Linda and I did. It was really quite Zen-like. I found out since that one of Howard's favorite books was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. No sooner had the Cardinal flatbed truck backed in and dumped its load in my driveway, and I donned my tool belt, then Howard meandered unannounced into the driveway in the beat-up and faded old Dodge pickup he'd just recently reacquired. I hadn't expected him, and frankly, I wasn't pleased that he'd come by, although I didn't let on to him. That wouldn't have been at all hospitable or respectful. I'd rather hope to take some personal and private time getting familiar with my hammer in the wood, taking some wild whacks and inflicting some dents, making as much noise as I wanted without attracting onlookers. This was amateur night. I'd read my undistinguished library of 2 framing books for the 15th time, absorbed an atomic amount of the information I'd need to get the job underway, and I wasn't interested in showcasing my incompetence before an audience, particularly an expert one. But Howard had come on a mission of mercy. We laughed about it as I retold the story to Gary in Howard's living room. He wanted to make sure that I got off to a plumb, level, and square start, and he'd come intending to demonstrate for me the basics of wall framing. And I'll be forever grateful. As I say, it was hot that Saturday morning, one of an endless succession of airless blast furnace days, leaving one gasping for air, slapping at droves of little biting flies, cursing Gitchy Gumi for perversely locking the door of her icebox. Whatever faint breeze we'd be getting came from the south. No relief for the wicked, as my mom used to say. Howard belted up, loaded up with long and beefy 16s, grabbed his framing hammer, and invited me onto the 24 by 26 concrete dance floor. All that was showing around the perimeter were the heads of the J-bolts that Billy, who'd laid down that dance floor, had installed according to my building plan. I'd already marked, measured, and drilled out the holes in the 2x6 pressure-treated sections of boards that I'd be using as the bottom plates for the building. Now, a businesslike no-nonsense Howard was turning back the clock to 1996, except that now he was in mentoring mode. He declared, "We're going to lay out a wall, and I got to show you the system that you should be using on all the walls you build, both first and second story from now on. Okay?" My lack of confidence and knowledge of what I'd need to be doing were transparent to Howard. But pride took a distant second place to attending to and practicing what Howard knew I needed, not just to know, but to do competently. He was surprisingly generous and patient during the entire process. "I'm sure you're going to do well once you get going, and you know that it goes without saying that I'm just down the street if you run into any difficulties that you can't figure out yourself. But I don't want you to get hurt. That's the most important thing. And I want you to use good, sound building principles. Do it right or don't do it at all. Plumb, square, and level. Studs nailed on center and stacked, along with joists on top of each other. And it all begins with carefully measuring and cutting lumber and laying out, flat on the slab, all of the framing elements for your rough opening. Let's take a look at your building diagrams for the walls, and let's pick one to lay out the framing." Pretty intimidating stuff. Put your hands up, face against the wall. Now reach slowly into your back pocket for your wallet, drop it on the floor, and kick it over to me. Luckily, I had plans. Oh boy, did I have plans. I'd been compulsively filing yellow legal pads full of them in the several weeks prior to the slab pour. The question was, which of these legal pads stacked on the kitchen island that Howard had built for Linda several years earlier contained the most recent plan of what I intended to build? It's not entirely professional looking to sprint off the job and into the house with tool belt clanging against flapping hammer. Sounds delightfully obscene, doesn't it? Now there's a fantasy. To sort frantically for the right plan to race back with and to present breathlessly to Howard. My working persona was definitely not of the cool, detached Jerry Tao wearing black Ray-Bans. My slip was showing. My hair was not staying up. My gown was puckering and gapping at the waist. I found a zit on my nose during my last look in the mirror, and I was surely going to be late for the prom. My plans were highly amusing to Howard, but he did compliment me on their neatness and clarity. There would be a problem not readily apparent on those wall layout plans that he'd take me to task for later, and I'll get to that in the next chapter. But for now, he could read what I intended, and noted that the north wall looking toward the lake offered the most interest and practicality as a primer for framing all subsequent walls. I nodded dutifully, said something insipid like "cool," and waited for further instructions. That wall plan was pretty simple. A 24-foot stretch containing an opening for a standard kitchen-sized double sash window and an opening for a standard 32 by 80-inch garage door. But Howard was astute in his choice. We'd need to lay out two rough openings of different proportions, each one occurring at the same height in the wall as the other. Not difficult. That's easy for me to say now, but essential practice for me in anticipation of the really big and daunting framing challenges ahead. The 8 by 7 foot garage door openings in the front wall, a wall that would need all of the stiffening I could provide for it in the center, the corners, and the built-up headers above the openings. The 7 by 6 foot openings in the front and rear second-story gable walls, where I'd eventually be installing a beautiful French door unit in the front and a large slider in the rear, which would need to be perfectly square. And last, the huge rough openings, some 5.5 feet high by 4 3/4 wide apiece, virtually floor to ceiling, to accommodate the enormous double cranking casement windows that would look out from the second floor over Superior and be set into a shed door on the wall that would offer another adventure in framing entirely. Learning to lay out and frame those gable walls would occur within a set of circumstances in which I'd be hanging my roof on a skyhook. I'd planned for a cathedral ceiling on the second floor, with my roof held up solely by a free-spanning pair of ungodly heavy and bolted 2x12s, and the rafters running from it to the adjacent walls, with a 4x8 post situated directly under it, where the space bisects into two equal portions and directly over a 4x8 post centered under the floor joist and on top of a rod drilled through the width of the concrete slab. But here we were, man and boy, or a boy and his dog, ready to collaborate on some stick building 101. First, Howard went back to the bed of the old Dodge Ram, retrieved a couple of old sawhorses. Howard would forever rag me about my Boston accent. That would be sawhorses, Bill, and shouldered them to the dance floor. These are yours now. I don't want to see them ever again. I'm donating them to the project. Use them in good health. And unless you think I'm being overly generous, I'm not doing you any really big favors. Any fool can plainly see that they've seen their better days. And he was right. They were worn, covered with the scars of overly deep blade cuts crisscrossing the crossbucks. On top of that, they looked like the one-legged whore who gave the sailors a hell of a ride. I never asked Howard why both horses had a leg shorter than the other, whether he intended them for a slightly side-hill job or whether he enjoyed seeing the pieces of his work jiggling away from him toward the floor. But I've still got them. In fact, they are just as serviceable and reliable as when he made me their custodian. I used them to assemble my garage doors, and on that same future Saturday afternoon, I cut lengths of soffit from them, blazing a few more creases in them, as I always do. Nearly worn out, deeply scarred, wildly unattractive, stooped close to the ground, but built for the long haul. More than just a little, like Howard. So away we went. He'd be giving me the straight poop and nothing but. First, Howard drilled me on the dimensions of the door. If its rough opening was set for 82.5 inches, allowing for the pre-hung unit we'd be setting into it, how wide would the boards for the header above and supporting the opening need to be? Why, an additional 1.5 inches on each side, I stammered. Exactly. So what are you waiting for? Set that circular saw humming and cut two 2x6 sections to that dimension and wait for further instructions. Then, to pick up the slack of the 5.5-inch wall dimension, since we'd be setting these boards on end, we'd need to trim off 3 2.5-inch widths of 2x6 to use as shims between each of the cut boards. After I nailed that little box together and laid it on its side on a concrete deck, we consulted my plans for the lengths of the jack studs that would be placed directly under each end of the headers. Howard reminded me that we'd have to include the width of the bottom plate in that dimension. After cutting the jacks, Howard instructed me to lay each of those jacks on top of a full 8-foot stud and nail them together, after which I placed them in the proper configuration with the header on the floor. We performed the identical operation for the construction of the header for the window to be placed in the wall, along with cutting the jacks and nailing them to studs to run from the bottom plate to the top plate. But this time those jacks were shorter, and 2x6 was cut to rest comfortably on those jacks as the sill of the window. It was time for marking the plate, along with a corresponding marking of a top plate of 2x6 from the straightest piece of lumber that we could select from the pile. As Howard had said, and I vividly remember watching him do this during the early framing of the great room in the cabin. I'm a visual person. I need to see things in my mind before I can build them. And scattering a bunch of studs and plates on a concrete floor served just that purpose at the same time as it served an even more important one. Working a system, Howard emphasized to me, was everything. By spreading an array of studs to fit the number of wall studs that my plan had stipulated, I was better able to see how the wall would look and how it was going to come together. More importantly, and even a novice like me could appreciate this one, I was able, with a minimal physical expenditure, to mark the placement of every one of those studs on the bottom and top plates, because I was marking them both simultaneously, as per Howard's instructions. Draw a line followed by a K for every single jack stud that framed a door and window opening. Mark with a line followed by a C, the cripples, the baby studs that would support the empty spaces beneath the sill and over a door header, and Mach 2 X's for the double studs that I'd be nailing together and situating at opposite ends of the plates. Pretty easy stuff. Mucho common sense. Very safe and effortless, unlike the terrific expenditure of energy required to assemble, nail, and locate on the J-bolts a wall built vertically. Sure, I'd read about this methodology in my super-duper framing books, but how it was leading me through that process in the only pedagogically effective way, by putting my hands all over it and doing it. And what my framing books didn't tell me was the way Howard customarily made a wall of his assembly line of double-studded ends, the door opening and framing of the window, step by logical step. Full stud became nailed into jack, followed by slamming nails through our made-up header into those jacks and adjoining studs, with the perfectly cut cripples toenailed to the header. When the frame door and window openings had been assembled and the double-studded ends had been nailed together, our jigsaw puzzle was almost complete. There was nothing left to do but set those framed and nailed pieces along with regularly spaced and standard length studs against their assigned marks, cozy up the bottom and top plates to the ends of the 2x6 framing lumber to those marks, give the entire wall a quick walkabout in order to spot any outstanding irregularities that had become a hallmark of my lack of concentration and mismeasurement, and then, with the easiest and most natural of hammer swinging motions, with one foot on stud and plate to hold them in position, nail those babies rhythmically together. Piece of cake. We're in business. As any true master teacher will do, Howard took off before the wall was done. The Socratic method. Quintessential mentorship. Who was that masked man? I wanted to thank him. But his timing was beautiful. All he wanted to do was to draw me into the system, to give me a lesson in the efficiency of effort, movement, and use of materials, to introduce me to the natural flow of the work. From his perspective as a former field supervisor who used to school hundreds of framers to a system, anything more would constitute economic suicide.